welcome to the Data Talks. This is episode 9, What is Digitalization? And if you arrive here for the first time, I ask you to go and look our other episodes in our website, data-talks.uni-münster with ua.de. Or hear our other episodes in our Spotify channel. Due to the social distance measures required by the coronavirus crisis, we witnessed an invasion of the digital in our lives. Suddenly, even those who are resistant, for example, asking for food through apps or work in digital environments, had no other choice than embrace digital. On the other side, small to big businesses had to quickly implement their digital vision or even to create one. Digitalization refers to adapting processes, either to adapt to digital communication or to create business models. In both of these views, it refers not to simply transform something analog into digital, but to create something new. However, what is created by digitalization layers up in existing societies with their rules, conflicts, and inequalities. In this regard, the adaptation of existing organizations or new business models can help solve or intensify existing problems. What can we expect in terms of changes in activity, socialization, and inclusion in the next few years? What does digitalization mean in 2022? To talk about that with us, we have today two special guests. From Germany, we received today Professor Dr. Benedikt Berger. Professor Berger holds the Chair of Digital Transformation and Society Department and Information Systems Institute from the University of Münster, and an institute which is associated with the European Research Center for Information Systems, ERCIS. His research interest addresses two topics: digital products, service, and digital transformation in the media industry, and the use, development, and management of information technology systems based on artificial intelligence and its consequences for companies, users, and in private and in professional contexts. He has a PhD degree in information systems and new media at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität in Munich and a master's degree in management at the University Mannheim. Professor Berger, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the very kind and extensive introduction.
Well, and from Brazil, it's my pleasure to receive here Mr. Fábio Seni, coordinator at the Núcleo de Informação e Coordenação do .br, NIC.br, a center in charge of implementing the projects of Management Committee for the Internet in Brazil, the CGI. The surveys conducted by the center have supported the definition of Brazilian government strategies for digital inclusion, universal access to broadband, e-government, and knowledge society development. Fábio Seni is also a PhD candidate in political science at the University of São Paulo, has a master's degree in communication from the University of Brasilia, and he's a researcher in communication focusing on digital inequalities. Mr. Seni, thank you for being with us today.
Hello, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Okay, so starting our discussion, Benedikt, you are professor at the Department of Digital Transformation and Society. Can you explain to us a little bit more of your research?
Yes, so first of all, you mentioned a lot already. So until I came here, I had basically two research foci. So throughout my studies, I was very interested in the media industry and particularly in digital media and how digital media offerings could thrive, because in the market, we always saw problems in how to finance digital media offerings. And that was basically my initial research interest. So in that perspective, I got into touch with the digital transformation of the media industry. We looked at different revenue models, ways to monetize digital content, for instance, by paywalls. In my dissertation, I researched the possibility to combine content and commerce offerings online. So that's more or less the first research focus I have. We also dived a little bit into different technologies. For instance, we did some studies on virtual reality. So that's kind of the media technology focus. And the second focus is on AI-based systems. So far, we mostly looked at how people use such systems. Two examples here. We researched how people make use of speech interaction, for instance, when they interact with voice assistants. And the second question or larger question that we looked into was whether people are willing to delegate tasks to AI-based systems. And we did this using the examples of robo-advisors. So whether people would delegate their management of their personal funds to a robo-advisor system. So that is what I brought to the table when I came here. And now obviously we continue to develop this. On the one hand, we're looking more into the development of AI-based systems nowadays as well. And on the other hand, we will, at my professorship, look into the topic of digital work, as this is connected with AI-based systems. So how these systems affect how we work and what we actually work. And this is, I think, also a very important topic from a societal perspective.
Well, really, really interesting, and at the same time broad. There is so many things going on, and really things that are changing really fast. I can relate of being a researcher in anything that has to do with technology, and I think Fabio also will agree with me that everything changes really fast. So it's definitely a lot of work to do. And Fabio, you work at nick.br, the research institute that investigates how society is using technology. So can you explain a little bit more to us your work at nick.br and also your PhD research that you are currently about to deliver?
Thank you. Yes, thanks for the introduction. My work at CETIC is connected to CETIC.br, which is a regional center on studies on the information society. So our main mission is to provide data, to provide statistics, to provide information on the access and use of internet in Brazil. We started by looking at individuals and companies, but nowadays we have more or less 10 nationwide projects covering areas such as government, civil society, and also areas like education, health, culture. So the idea is to have a very broad vision on how the different policies and society in general is adopting ICTs. And of course, along these more than 16 years of CETIC, the agendas were changing. So nowadays we are also investigating how artificial intelligence and big data and robotics in companies. So we also have to change dynamically the agendas and the type of indicators we want to provide. But the idea of the center is to really provide society with information and policymakers with information to decide and to run better policies. So this is our main goal. And regarding my specific PhD research, I'm of course using this huge database of produced by CETIC. So we have more than, along with our national statistical office in Brazil, we have more than 20 years of data on how Brazil is using the internet. So my PhD takes advantage of this database. But my question is, I'm trying to give a new perspective to a very old question, in fact, which is, it's presented in the very beginning of the discussion of the digitalization, which is, will the digitalization and the use of internet be a solution for solving problems and to include people into improve their lives, or will be or they will be only reproducing inequalities and structural inequalities that society has offline. So will is there, what are the dynamic relationship between inequalities online and inequalities offline? So this is my main question, and I'm taking advantage of all those data in Brazil to understand whether you can measure, in a sense, what happened in the past, and how are nowadays the structure of digital inequalities in the country. So this to say a little first note on the research.
Well, thank you very much. And now we're starting the discussion mainly. I have a question that goes a little bit for both of you. So digitalization is a concept that it's not new. We have to have this idea that it's something quite modern, especially this is a word that we say a lot in Germany. I would say more, we say more Digitalisierung than Digitalisation, for sure. And I found articles in 2018 that were talking about this already, which seems another world in terms of technology. In publications, maybe 2018 is not so old, but for technology, it's quite old, especially having a pandemic in the middle. So, and these articles were mentioning basically that digitalization refers to processes, as I said in the beginning, it stands really differentiate between digitalization, and digital transformation. And I would like to ask you, how do you think that this concept is still, especially for Professor Berger, but also for Fabio, Benedict, and also Fabio, do you think that this concept of digitalization, it still works in 2022, or with the increase of use of artificial intelligence, for example, this concept looks a little bit old? What do you would have to say about this?
Well, there were a couple of interesting points here. So first, you mentioned the language differences, which I find quite interesting. Obviously, I don't know nothing about this in Portuguese, but comparing English and German, in English we have digitization and digitalization, and in German we only have Digitalisierung. But so English is a little more fine-grained here, which is helpful because we can basically differentiate 3 different steps, the ones you mentioned. So digitization just means taking something that is analog and transferring it into a digital object. So that can be, usually it's about information, documents, this kind of thing. Digitalization then means that we use digital technologies to improve the way we are currently doing things. So I can, for instance, become faster in terms of a certain process if I digitalize this process. Let me stick with the media industry. If I want to, if I'm working at a radio station and I'm producing a piece and I have to cut all the audio files, then it's much faster to do this in a digital way than to do it using analog means. And the third step is digital transformation, which means that we start to do things differently or doing different things all over. So we don't, for instance, we don't produce a radio program anymore, but we are now producing a podcast that you can listen to on demand anytime, because it's stored on a server and you can request it whenever you want. So that's a totally different concept from what we did before, producing kind of a radio program, right? So that is digital transformation. And I think, so coming back to your question, whether this concept still works, I'm not sure if it's a matter of whether it works or not. It's ongoing, it's ubiquitous. Of course, it's progressing. So more and more things, industries, markets, products, services get digitalized. And I don't think it has lost any the concept has lost any importance by now, although we are stepping up the ladder, or more and more organizations are stepping up the ladder I just described.
I think I start to, when we do the programs with around the concept, I usually start making this question because I do think there is a lot of idealization, a lot of normative behind sometimes a concept, especially when we talk about technology. My original field research is digital democracy, and there was a lot of expectation over digital democracy. And so I like to make always this question, because I think, are we still talking about the same thing that we were talking about 3 years ago? And I think this is a good opportunity that I have to ask really intelligent people about it.
Yeah, it's perfectly fine. So it's good to establish the base terms before we engage in a discussion.
And Fabio, so in NICBR, you mentioned already, you have this amazing data with 20 years. I was going to ask you another thing, but before that, if you also can ask when you answer my question, if you can answer if this data is available for researchers, especially in Brazil, because most of people doesn't know where to find this data. So how could they find it if it's already on Transparência Ativa? It's already on demand for researchers. But I also would like to ask you, how do you see that the digitalization changed in the last years in Brazil and in South America? I saw Nick Berry recently published a report about Mercosul frente a mudanças tecnológicas. It would be really nice to hear this from you.
Thank you. Now, in general, I agree with Benedict on the idea that it's an ongoing concept. So, and I think when you go to the history of how people mention those processes, like when you used to talk about cyber things, and then we use about internet, and now digital. So, tracking all this, the history of the concept is important to see in a sense, what are we talking about? So, in a sense that I think nowadays, and thinking about why it matters to understand those types of processes, I think I would say that we have, I would say that at least 3 types of issues that we might want to consider when talking about digitalization. One of them is that I think nowadays internet is a fundamental resource, or a primary good, or if you like, a right, a new type of human right. So I think it's very difficult nowadays to say that you can be fully a citizen in our societies without connection or access to the internet. So I think this is quite new, because recently United Nations recognized this role of internet. But I do think it's important to mention that normatively we all agree that it's impossible to be out of this process. So this is why digital inequalities I think are so important. But as Professor Berger mentioned, digital is also enabler to other rights. So it's interesting, because you can see the internet and ICTs in quite all types of policies, social policies, education, health, social assistance. And so it's important to mention that nowadays you can use this tool to enable all other results. And finally, I think that thinking about skills and the idea that you acquire some types of skills that are totally new from what we have in the past. I think nowadays those skills are awarded by the labor market, by the society. So you need to have also to think about digital skills and capability of doing having those opportunities produced. So I would like to say that, just to say that the concept is changing, but what we try to do in NIC.br is to track all these aspects. So we generally divide all the indicators in access indicators is whether people are or are not connected, what type of connection, what type of, and in what places they use, and in which organizations have the internet and the connection. We are also worried about what type of uses, because even when people are connected, there are inequalities on what type of uses they can manage online, and this is very important to see the results in the end. And finally, the idea of appropriation and skills, which is important to understand how people can benefit from the online engagement. So all the surveys that we have are nation are collected in Brazil. They are fully available online, and they have quite this structure of measuring, not just measuring infrastructure or if people have fiber optics or stuff like that, but also to understand what type of uses, what people do online and how can they benefit from being online.
And from your perspective, so how would you say that Brazil is in digitalization right now? We are still too much depending on mobile devices, or we are more connected? Because I think in terms of time connected, Brazil is like one of the top 10, top one, top three. I don't know exactly which place it is, but we Brazilians, we stay a lot of time connected since always. And but from other things, how we would describe that is the scenario of digitalization based on the data that you gather in CETIC.
Yeah, I think Brazil is a quite interesting case, because I in my research I usually call this what I call an equal inclusion, because we do have inclusion. If you take, we came from almost nobody online to nowadays we have 152 million people connected. It's not a small amount of people. It's more than several countries in terms of people online in Brazil. So I think it's important to see this process or very fast and dynamic inclusion, which was based on an interesting model of spread of the internet in the country, or in a society that is quite interested in being online, and it's very active online, and moves fast in this term. But at the same time, we have a huge inequality, still a huge inequality in access, such as in Amazon region or rural areas. This is still place in Brazil. So if you go to older people from low socioeconomic backgrounds and low level of education, you will see people disconnected. So this is important to mention. But because of the pandemic, we saw a very huge increase in online activities, being online, including for poor people, because if you go to what the government did to support people during the COVID, the transfers, the financial transfers that were did, they were primarily did by the internet via app and mobile apps, and in a very fast way. So I think I would say that the case of Brazil is very interesting, because it's a huge country with a huge amount of internet users, but a huge inequalities in what people do online and can do online, depending on all those social backgrounds that I've mentioned.
And Benedict, it would be interesting to get your point of view on how you see the digitalization in Germany, especially at this moment.
So of course, if you would ask 100 people that question, then probably 90 would say the situation is bad. So it's pretty common to complain about digitalization in Germany. So the administration is not digital, sufficiently digital. We don't have any large purely digital companies compared to the American or Chinese economy. So, and of course, there is something to it, right? But on the other hand, I would say the picture is maybe not as black or dark as it is painted sometimes. So first of all, we have, I think, quite some talent here in Germany in terms of students. That's at least what I can see every day in my job. We have very interesting startups with very good business ideas. I think, for instance, in terms of the economy, so venture capital funding situation is improving in Germany. And we also see substantial efforts by the government, both the past one and the current one, to improve the digitalization of the administration. And of course, this takes time, maybe, but I'm a little guessing here. The German engineering tradition is a little bit at cross with the development of digital products and services, which is more in terms of trial and error, establish minimum viable products very quickly and test them in the market. That's obviously not the way an administration works. So, and that's not the way you would construct a car usually. So maybe that's why we have some problems in adapting to this. In terms of society, because I think that's also important. I mean, we had this discussion of a digital divide quite for a while, but by now in Germany, we are there. I mean, we still have some problems with infrastructure too, and that's something I think is really annoying and wouldn't be necessary. But we're nearing, or we have above 90% of the people being online, and I think the number is growing and the infrastructure is improving. So the digital divide, I think, is by now more an international phenomenon between different countries, specifically when comparing industrial countries with the global south. So there are larger differences here in terms of who's connected. I think that we have in education, which is also a very important part of the society, we still have to make up in progress in terms of how both the education itself becomes digitalized, as well as how we educate students to deal with digitalization, to understand digitalization, understand digital products and services. So yeah, I see a lot of progress. Usually we are rather cautious at some stages, for instance, regarding digital voting during elections or something like that. We're not pressing hard in this direction, I would say, but that also has its merits, I think, at some stages. And overall, my last point, in the EU, we by now see these strong effort to regulate also the digital sphere, both the public sphere, governmental issues, but also the economy. That's kind of a unique value proposition, I would say, comparing to the American, both North and South American models, maybe, as well as to the Chinese model and the way we build our digital economy and infrastructure. When I'm not sure if it's really the superior way. I just say it also has some value, and we will see how it plays out.
I think you were the first specialist, a German specialist, who doesn't say something right in the beginning about privacy. Do you think that privacy, the fear of not having too much privacy, or the fear of let me find the words in English, sorry, the fact that Germans are cautious about their private, do you think this is also a barrier to digitalization, or to adoption of some technologies?
Well, I'm not a sociologist, right? So I don't want to make wrong assumptions here. Of course, the German history, we have had really bad experiences with the state, with surveillance by the government. So that, and I think this likely plays a role in terms of how you view such matters. And I think there's also evidence that privacy for the overall population is more important, maybe over here than it is in other countries. We also saw this very nicely, for instance, when we had the discussion around the development of a distance tracking app, a social contact tracing app. So in Germany, in the end, we had a very privacy aware solution, which of course has the merit that more people are willing to adopt it because they don't have to fear that there will be kind of location profiles of them accumulated somewhere, which could be hacked or even sold. And on the other hand, of course, it limits what the technologies can do, and maybe it's also less effective than a less privacy safe option. But so yeah, I would say this is a value that's very strong here. I mean, also in Europe, we have the GDPR, a privacy regulation, which I think is rather state of the art worldwide. But we now can observe that other countries are following these concepts and adopting a lot of what has been established here. And of course, GDPR is far from perfect. If you visit websites from like out of Europe, then you're often shown all these cookie banners. That's probably not the really best solution to handle privacy questions, but at least it's making people aware that their data can be tracked. And that's, I think, something that's really important. I'm not a huge Apple supporter, but Steve Jobs put it nicely when he said privacy is that you tell people what happens to their data, and that you do this ongoingly, right? So you make them aware what happens with the data that is gathered about you. So, and that's, I think, just a thing that's fair to do. And obviously there are organizations that are interested in gathering data without people being aware, but I think it's better for society overall if we know what's going on and what's happening.
I was muted now. Just to mention, Brazil was one of the countries that implemented a really similar legislation to the GDPR. I remember studying the LGPD, which is exactly the same letters, but in Portuguese. Well, I remember finding a lot of similarities, and this was 1 or 2 years after Germany has implemented. So it was interesting to see the same law into completely different context. Fabio, still in this subject, do you think that the researchers capture something about the researchers in CETIC? Do you think that they capture something about privacy issues? I mean, do you think that citizens in Brazil are considering this issue, or they are more looking for other things?
Yeah, I think this is a very difficult issue to research, especially in quantitative surveys, because it's a very broad and difficult concept to translate into personalize into really good questions that you can track. But I would say that in the case of Brazil, if you see the data of internet usage, you see that Brazilians are very attracted and they like. I think they like when they can they are very they have this disposition to be online and to connecting in online platforms. So if you see our rates of presence in social media or using voice calls, or if you take instant messaging, how Brazilian really, even if you take the poor population. So the stratification of usage comes when you analyze more sophisticated uses like online courses, or financial transactions. But when it comes to very general platforms, the Brazilians are very interested in to get into this issue. So for one side, this debate on privacy is still ongoing. Of course, our law still is in the phase of implementation, so we still do not have yet quite the results of what will happen because of the implementation of the law. But the survey we had on CETIC, especially in the context of COVID, was that in a sense, Brazilians have they recognize privacy or security problems when mainly when they have something to they have some case of losing money or have a fraud or a bank account hacked or something. So these are the main concerns, and not what we used to in the discussion consider privacy. So I do think this is still not fully an issue in the whole society. You know, how the data is used, how the data is processed and used by the platforms. This is still an ongoing debate, and I think it will be, it tends to be more important in the future than used to be in the past. Nowadays, I think the debate is too much concerned with frauds and security online, and not just the idea of not having your data used in a way that you don't want to use and stuff like that. So this is my first perspective of this case.
This is interesting because this shows also that some cases from personal data that was gathered by outright politicians also. Yeah, I remember this case. I was still living in Brazil. This was in 2019, before the pandemics, and there was already some profiles of people that would be activists, and it's curious to see that it's not even a judgment. It's I'm curious to see that. I find it interesting to see that even with these cases, this is not something that the society thinks too much, especially consider all the debates in terms of enabling rights, as you mentioned before, that internet provides us, and all the discussions that we see online about some basic rights, some civil rights, and in the same time,
Yeah.
looks like two parallel worlds, right?
Yeah, no, and I think this is an interesting issue of inequality that I think it's important, because if you take just the number of internet users, if you compare Brazil and Germany, we are not quite so different in terms of percentage of people in a way connected to the internet. So, but when it comes to social inequalities, you start to see that, for instance, in Brazil, when you go to lower status users, they are basically using mobile phones. They don't have access to any computer or tablets or other devices. They are basically online through mobile phones. We packages that the data packets that allow them to do very basic stuff, and that's why the platforms use zero rating strategies to make people use instant messaging and social networks. So I think this is important, because this is the most vulnerable population is online to very precarious ways of connection, and they're more vulnerable also to disinformation and into the circulation of bad information, and they even don't have a very good connectivity for checking this, if there is information right, and to engage in other types of engagement online. So this is important, because it's not anymore the case of not being online or being or not being. The case is what type of, how being online is meaningful to your life, and if you are able to critically understand what your data and what are the content that you are sharing and receiving online. So this is where education and skills and in media literacy. This is where all these more social agendas of understanding of digital comes. So so I think this is interesting because it's this type of disinformation and misuse of data affects primarily people that are more vulnerable, and those in the case of Brazil are the ones that don't have quite a very good access to the internet.
Yeah, I think there are some very interesting points. So because I didn't think of it by now in terms of education and or let's say social status and access, but I would fully agree. Although it's also not my deeper expertise here in this field, but I think that shows us also again the importance of education. So I mean, digitalization, and as one very prominent phenomenon of digitalization, the World Wide Web, it's basically like a wonderland, right? And if you just send people in there without any guidance, of course they get attracted by offerings or by people that may not have their best of their customers in interest, right? So I think it's important that we kind of get to a point where we educate people about how certain digital business models work, what certain organizations want, especially if you get something for free, how you can deal with information. I mean, there's always two sides to the medal. The amount of information that you have access to just by using a mobile phone today, it's incredible. It exceeds anything that we could even imagine 30 years ago. And you can pretty much access any news website in the world. And unless there's a paywall, you can read, you have access to public information. But of course, all this comes with the downside that people with bad intentions or different intentions make use of this for their advantage and pull out fake news, misinformation. And therefore, it's more important, I think, than before that we educate people about how to tell the difference between the good and the bad, to simplify here a little bit.
Well, I'm going to change a little bit the subject, talking more about going back to digitalization and the view of processes. So there is a tendency and higher tendency to automizing decision-making process. So, and recently there is a big debate regarding how those algorithms that are made to make decisions are created. So for those who who might be listening to us and don't necessarily understand what I say, is that the algorithm is going to take a decision based on decisions that were made in the past. So it would have a database of what it was decided from a specific situation, and this algorithm will take a decisions based in these decisions in the past, which were made by humans with their intention and non-intentional bias. So there is going on a large ethical debate. And I would like to know if, in your perspective, from Benedict and from Fabio, if this ethical debate impacted the extension of implementation of those algorithms or decision-making, automatized decision-making systems. And if you would say that governments and companies are now more careful, or if this debate is still going on only on civil society and didn't reach this spheres that would implement those algorithms.
If you want to go ahead, Fabio, otherwise I can. Okay, so Yes, I would say this debate is very important. It's very lively, which is also important. And I would say it affects the decisions to implement such algorithms. It's really a multifaceted issue and difficult to grasp in a short time. But obviously, one of the problems if we talk about decision making is usually what we try to, there are different interests, of course. From if we are an organization, then we are mostly interested in making profit. From a societal perspective, we are looking for some kind of fairness when we make decisions. And even the fairness concept, there are many ideas of what fairness actually can mean, and it's difficult to implement these various aspects, or to identify, okay, what are we actually optimizing our decision making for. Now, I think automated decision making can be advantages over human decision making in that it, at least theoretically, is able to eradicate some human biases, right? So of course, humans are not perfectly fair decision makers or profit optimizing decision makers themselves, and automated decision making might have offer the opportunity to get some improvement in these dimensions. Of course, if you build the systems that make these decisions by training them by past decisions of humans, then you cannot expect any kind of improvement here in these terms, because what they will do is they will replicate what humans in the past have done in the future. So I think that is something rather obvious. So and that's basically computer science, what we have to look at is how we may be able to improve the decision making by maybe comparing to what human performance has been in the past, and how we can get a little bias in these human decisions. And we always say bias in the data, but the data, it's mostly created by recording what humans have done or decided, at least in this case. So we have to think about ways how we can eradicate this. And we have to, what's important and also much discussed, the issue of transparency. We have to detect whether bias in decision making occurs or not. And based on this information, we have to clearly decide whether the current technological progress is sufficiently good to allow to implement this decision making for various decisions. For instance, for credit default scoring, for the decisions to release prisoners early on, or to convict them in the first place. So these are very important decisions that affect humans' life extensively. And of course, unless we cannot understand how these decisions are in the end made, I think we should be very careful in applying them or in automating them. However, we always should be aware that humans are not perfect in making these decisions either. So it's really a multifaceted problem.
I'm thinking here in this debate, what I think is really interesting is how can we control that, right? Because in some cases, it's really obvious that it should be transparency. So if we are talking about the justice systems applying the penalties, or surveillance in digital cameras, public digital cameras, which is happening which happens in the subway in Brazil. This is a quite obvious places where automated decision making should be looked. But at the same time, all the businesses in many models are creating ways to automatize that, and it's interesting that I never saw so far a discussion about so there is a lot of discussion about creating data teams inside of businesses, but I never saw a discussion. Well, I might be not informed about it, and that's okay. But I don't say that I know everything. But so far, I haven't seen any discussion of creating a kind of ombudsman, for example, or something that would not. I don't want to say regulate, but pay attention to these ethical issues that automatizing this kind of decision process should bring. And if Benedict, you talked, for example, about credit, this is a good example of a system that is highly automatized in every place. In Brazil is also the credit score, and sometimes we have a roughly idea of how this works, but it affects the lives of many people, nah? Especially people who are more vulnerable. So it's interesting that I haven't seen so far a discussion about this, although and how to control transparency of private companies, right? There is Daniel Trielli. He is a researcher. He used to work in Estadão in Brazil, and now he is a PhD candidate at Northwestern University. And he has this amazing project called Algorithm Tips. And in this project, he and his supervisor, which I'm sorry, I forgot his name, of the supervisors, they investigate all the algorithms used by the US government in national level. And he said in a Congress, in a Brasil Congress in 2019, he was mentioning that, okay, we reached a point that the government was hiring those companies to run these algorithms. And well, actually they were terceirizando, they were I forgot this word in English.
Outsourcing, I don't know.
Outsourcing, thank you. They were outsourcing a service, and the service was doing the company was using automate decision making process. Okay, but then they would say, okay, how did you make this decision? And they say, well, this is a private secret, this is a private business. So it's interesting to see these layers, because some things are really obvious, but the others are not so obvious.
Yeah, and I think what is quite new in terms of what we had in the past, I think one issue that is very different is that the fact that you raised that even if you are offline, or if you don't have really quite good connection, you are affected by this, because you can no longer be out of this. Because we used to have the idea when we talk about digital inclusion that there are people out of the internet or offline or disconnected. But nowadays, if you take a bus in a huge city, if you have online cameras and other stuff, you have the school system connected using algorithms, and you have health. So it is, I think nowadays it is impossible to say that who is out and who is in, because everybody in a sense affected by this. But at the same time, as Benedict mentioned, the data we have is biased by inequality. So in a sense that, of course, what are the implications, for instance, in terms thinking about governments to use in an African country a platform trained by data or for European data? So what are really the implications of training those algorithms with data that we know that are biased by those that are more connected and online? So what are the implications even for consumption in credit to use data that of those that are really can do online financial transactions and stuff like that. So I think this is interesting. So in a sense that everybody is affected, but is affected in different ways depending on the bias on the data we have in place.
I'm going to jump to our last question, actually, because our time is almost up. And talking about a little bit of the future, or I don't know, the present or the future, or it's hard to say. I bring the discuss of the metaverse, especially because we're discussing a lot of NFTs. So actually, my motivation about asking you about the metaverse is more due to all the discussion of NFTs that we had last year than actually that I know people who have been using this kind of technology. I don't actually know many people. So I would say, I would ask you how really quickly, if it's possible, from Benedict, for Benedict and also for Fabio, how do you see this scenario of using metaverse in next years? Do you think that is actually something that companies and citizens will migrate to this platform and spend time online in this way? I'm not talking about video games because I think this is one specific area and it has its own development, but talking about more broadly how our society is going to live, do you think metaverse is actually something that will be a reality for us in a few years?
This time you please go first, Fabio.
Yeah, this is interesting because I'm really, of course, we don't have yet research on that, what people, because this is something to come. But I would say by the evidence we have, because we track uses of the internet before the social media and then the web 2.0 and nowadays all the other developments, I would say that if we have a trend in all those process of adoption, is a trend of also, of course, inequalities in people being the first adopters and coming later the later adopters, which are usually those with less conditions to choose that. So we need to track this on this case. I think what is different is that of course, there's a huge potential because as we already mentioned, we have much more people online and connect to, in a sense, to digital technologies. But I still think that we need to see how this is going to be implemented and rise in countries like Brazil, where at the same time we have a gaming industry that is very active and rich. At the same time, we have people there have very precarious and limited connections. So I don't think everybody will be in a minute using those type of technologies, but I do think there's a potential for adoption that we need to track. I can't say more than that.
Well, so let me first answer to your NFT aspect. So I think, as far as I have understood NFTs, the idea of creating ownership on of a unique digital object is interesting, because so far everything digital was kind of abundant because you could easily copy it, and that also like created problems. I started by talking about media monetization, so that is especially difficult in this case. So having kind of unique digital objects that you can assign ownership to somebody is basically interesting. It creates scarcity, and scarcity is obviously an important driver in the economy. So I would say this is an interesting concept. I cannot predicting about digital technologies is something where you can only lose. So I don't know how it will turn out. I would guess that there are interesting applications for this, like we currently see in art, for instance. And I probably you could imagine more. So yes, I would say that's an interesting concept. Regarding the metaverse, and I know it's these concepts are also connected. When thinking of a metaverse as a virtual world in which you can immerse, in our studies on virtual reality, we found out that people generally like what they perceive when they make use of virtual reality applications. It's kind of a cool experience, but it's also still very cumbersome in terms of the hardware, right? You have to wear these huge goggles. It easily causes nausea. You cannot, with many of these hardware or head-mounted displays, as you call them, you cannot move freely, or at least not fully. And yeah, I'm not. I mean, the hardware will probably become better and better, and I could imagine that once this happens, more and more people would be willing to engage in such a thing. I could imagine that it's not a fully digital world, but maybe more enhancing or a mix. VR, virtual reality, augmented reality somehow mixed with our real world perception. So I think there are interesting applications for this. Yeah, let's see how it turns out.
Well, yeah, I don't expect no one to to actually make a strong provision of how it's going to be, but I think it was a really interesting topic that at least I need to make one lesson for you, enjoying the fact that you're here. So our time is unfortunately up. I would like to thank Fabio Seni and Benedict Berger for joining us today. And yeah, so thank you, Fabio, for giving us this time.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like to enjoy talking to you, and thanks for the invitation.
And also thank you, Benedict Berger, for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Fabio, and all the team in the background for making this happen. It was a pleasure.
So Data Talks is a series of talks between experts from Brazil and Germany who discuss the use of public data in today's society and also the metaverse. The Data Talks is an initiative from myself, Jessica Vogt, as a part of the German Chancellor Fellowship from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and is hosted and supported by the Brazil Center of the University of Münster in the framework of the Strategic Partnership Project VVU.USP, funded by the DAAD. This is the last episode, so I would like to give a special thanks to our executive team, Kate Cari dos Santos from the Brazil Center of the University of Münster, and Juliana Heredia, our technical support and editor who assisted us in our episodes. I would also like to thank Mrs. Anya Greco and Professor Dr. Bernd Hellingrath, who believed in this project and actually made all of this possible. Thank you very much. And I see you all in a next opportunity.